The rise of capitalism, one of the formative influences on modern Europe, is the subject of an enormous and contentious scholarship. The new economic and social order took root over many centuries. Historians have long devoted much attention to the 2.5 centuries from the Black Death to the onset of the 17th century crisis. In this period, from about 1350 to about 1620, two of capitalism's central attributes became firmly and widely entrenched. Commercialization, that is, the market as the fundamental economic institution, and a polarized class structure. According to Karl Marx, the origins of capitalism lay in original or primary accumulation. Over many decades, these interpretations have been fiercely debated, elaborated, and modified, and important new explanatory factors have been introduced. But no scholarly consensus exists on how to account for the rise of capitalism. Maurice Dobb, the Marxist historian, had argued that internal contradictions in the land-based feudal economy had led to the rise of capitalism. This argument was refuted by the American historian Paul Sweezy in his commercialization model.
Paul Sweezy, in a piece that he wrote in 1950, argued that while Dobbs' diagnosis of the malady of feudalism was entirely correct, and while he agreed entirely with the chronological schema of Dobbs' treatment of the decline of feudalism, he argued that Dobb had emphasized in all the wrong points.
After 1000 AD, European population and economy underwent brisk growth. Colonists settled and improved large territories. New towns were founded and existing ones greatly expanded. Crafts flourished, and local, interregional, and long-distance trade also flourished, mostly on overland routes that spread across the continent.
Sweezy argued that while the economy of no outlets dominated the countryside, the important point was that towns had survived. Dobb had accounted for this argument by saying that towns provided some basic functions of providing some items of daily use, such as salt and spices, and this was adequate in explaining how the revival, when it happened, managed to make inroads into the feudal economic structure. Sweezy argued that if Dobbs' question of contradiction is to be taken very seriously, internal contradictions should have existed almost everywhere where feudalism prevailed. And Sweezy argued that this did not fit the developments as they played out. Because if feudal lords were to be enticed by the prospects of new commodities that were available, Sweezy argued new commodities were available all over Europe. Then why, he inquires, was feudalism on the decline in West Europe, but feudalism was also ascendant in East Europe? How did this contradiction get resolved in Dobbs? Sweezy argued that Dobb did not even address this contradiction, that in the 14th, 15th century, when feudalism was declining in West Europe, feudalism was actually being reinvigorated in Eastern Europe. In the lands east of Elba, the feudal lords were tightening their grip on the mode of production, and they're tightening their grip on their estates. Sweezy argued that this Dobb failed to account for simply because there was a factor that he had underplayed. In his emphasis on the problems internal to the feudal structure, he was overlooking the external factor, which is commercialization, which is the booming of commerce, European commerce. Sweezy argued that, following Dobb and following Perrine and Bloch before him, that the pivotal factor in the making of the feudal order was not simply that the economy was based on land. Sweezy said this was not the cause, this was the effect. The cause behind the feudalization of Western Europe lay in the fact that the commercial civilization that had existed in Europe for over 1,000 years from the Roman times had given way. An economy which was very vibrantly urban, very vibrantly commercial, with a very strong manufacturing sector and one of the most highly monetized economies of the ancient world, suddenly became demonetized.
Although overwhelmingly agrarian, Europe was not completely non-monetized. Commerce developed after the dawn of the new millennium and centered initially in northern and central Italy.
By the 11th century, however, Sweezy argues, as the commercial revolution began to unfold once again, and Europe began to re-emerge as a commercial civilization, this entire trajectory of European economy once again began to change. At a time when the land-based economy was predominantly in control of the social surplus, some surplus continued to be generated outside the ambit of the feudal order. And Sweezy highlighted this very point, that the towns throughout remained outside the ambit of feudal order.
Together with the early decline of serfdom, the precocious revival of towns fostered production by urban artisans. Peasants were encouraged or compelled to supply food, raw materials, and funds to city-states.
When in the 11th century the towns began to prosper once again, there was naturally a tension between the merchants who were prospering and the people who wielded power in the countryside. The normal trajectory had been that when a town was beginning to flourish, the feudal lords who were located in the adjacent lands would generally come and invade, generally come and raid and plunder. Also, when merchants were moving from town to country or from country to town, they were fair game for the feudal lords and his retainers. So with time, the towns began to seek protection from whatever rump authority would give them that kind of protection. And the towns gradually began to gain what are known as charters of freedom by the monarch, by the king, by the emperor, depending on where in Europe they were located. It became then the responsibility of the central authority to extend this protection. Why was this protection not being given before the 11th century? Because before the 11th century, the towns did not have anything else to offer. But at a time when commerce was growing, 11th century onwards, the towns were making money, and what they were basically doing is that they were buying the charters of freedom. So they began to bankroll the centralization of military authority undertaken by the monarchs. This happened in France, this happened in Germany, and this happened in England. As a consequence, when the towns began to fund the enlargement of the military force at the behest under the command of the king, under the aegis of the king, they began to gain a political and financial strength. They began to gain a political strength which flowed from their financial strength, which was not there earlier to reckon with. As a result, the towns began to carve out a space completely independent of the feudal lord. The feudal lord could not venture into the towns without any written authorization from the municipal administration that was running the town itself. And if there was to be any violation, the monarch would intervene and flush the feudal lords out. So the independent space that the town had earlier enjoyed now became politically a very powerful force. It was becoming a very powerful agent of change. And Sweezy argued that this growing significance of the towns, politically as well as economically, backed by the military power of the crown, was a very important factor in breaking open the feudal order.
The unique position of the Italian peninsula between the flourishing Middle East and the Transalpine Europe helped expansion. In addition to this, the stimulus provided by the Crusades resulted in the establishment of trading colonies in the Levant and around the Black Sea. The expansion of the fiscal apparatus of the papacy prompted Italians to organize commercial, financial, and transport networks throughout the Mediterranean and adjacent areas and on into northern and eastern Europe.
Just as there was a push factor, pushing the serfs away from the estate, which is what Dobb was speaking about, Sweezy argued that they were running to the towns rather than to the forests, or rather than rising up in arms, because this was a viable alternative. There was a pull factor. The town had a pull factor. And what was this pull factor? Sweezy argued that it was logistically possible for a serf, a fugitive serf, to actually stay away from the gaze of the feudal lord for a full year. Two ways. One, once he enters into the town, he cannot be followed by the feudal lord's retainers. For the feudal lord to drag him back to the estate, he has to be caught outside the perimeters of the town. There was this legal thing. There was also a logistical problem. When a serf moved into the town, he did not necessarily have to remain in the town. As groups of merchants were beginning to move all across Europe, they were moving from Italy into the heartlands of the Flanders, they were maybe moving into France, and they were moving up north. In this entire medley, an individual serf could always join a caravan of merchants and keep moving away from his place of origin. He could then sail on board a ship and head out to Asia. By the time he came back, almost a year would have passed, and he would have successfully eluded capture. So the town had the charm of giving the serf an opportunity of eluding escape for one full year. There was a third factor that worked in favor of the towns. The serf who had left his land had no other means of earning a livelihood. When he came to the towns, there were other occupations that were opening up. So he could, if he had some artisanal skill as a weaver, he could get work as a weaver in the city guild, but that was not necessarily easy. He could, however, begin as a shop hand in a store that was opened to provide provisions for the merchants. Or, because these towns were growing in size and more merchants were passing through, more and more inns were coming up. More and more blacksmiths were required, and because the size of the town was growing and the size of the caravans were also growing, it was generating more and more demand for labor. And a fugitive serf running away from a feudal estate into the town was never short of job opportunities of a lower scale, unskilled jobs, but jobs nonetheless. So just as there was a push factor that was pushing them out of the feudal estate, there was the pull factor of the towns, the alternative means of earning livelihood, and the possibility of eluding escape and gaining freedom that attracted the serfs into the town.
By the 13th century, independent merchant republics controlled nearly all of central and northern Italy. Autonomous urban communities pockmarked all of the other regions. However, Eastern Europe was still in the shade of agrarian fiefdoms.
When trade was beginning to grow, and traders who were earlier trading probably only between Florence and Alexandria, say, they would now begin to move inland into Europe. The whole Mediterranean commercial network began to sort of exchange its wares with the Northern Sea merchants. So people from across the Northern Sea, from the Scandinavian islands, from the northern parts of Germany, from France, from Britain, they would all meet in annual fairs in Europe. Most famous fair at this point of time was in the region that we know for its wine, Champagne. In places like Champagne, in places like Cannes, in places like Flanders, annual fairs would drag merchants from all over Europe where they would exchange goods, commodities. And this required perennial travel. So there could be one fair in one part of France in the month of May. There would be a different fair in the month of April somewhere else in Germany, maybe after a time, say by the end of December, it could be a fair in Italy, merchants kept on moving. And as more and more merchants kept on moving, more and more caravans kept on moving, the need to rest at night generally led to the formation of new towns. So if merchants would come and pass through a region repeatedly on a particular track, and they would shelter at night, then after a time a fugitive serf would probably come and set up an inn there, and then there would be someone brought in to attend to the horses, attend to the horseshoes. So a blacksmith would come in, a stable hand would come in, and a town would begin to grow if the caravans moved in on a regular basis. Sweezy argued that this led to a round of urbanization in Europe, a second wave of urbanization, as new towns began to grow all across Germany, all across northern Italy, northern France, and in the Flanders. And as more and more towns came up, these acquired charters of freedom, and they created more and more safe havens all across. Sweezy argued that this was the really pivotal factor in the breakdown of the feudal order. In Western Europe, where more and more towns began to emerge, the feudal order came under more and more pressure. In Eastern Europe, by comparison, Sweezy argued, the commerce had left the feudal estate comparatively untouched because Eastern Europe was on the peripheries of this growing commercialization. East Europe was only supplying bulk commodities of grain, and they were buying out heavily. No towns were allowed to grow because the entire mediation between the serfs who grew the crops and the merchants who purchased it was done by the feudal lords themselves. So commercialization in the peripheries of Eastern Europe did not result in the growth of towns, and Sweezy would argue this was the reason why serfdom did not collapse, because the serfs did not have an alternative. They did not have a place to go to. They did not have an alternative set of lifestyle beckoning them the way it did in Western Europe. By comparison, Western Europe became far more urbanized. Therefore, far more pockets of freedom were out there in the open, and the feudal order began to collapse when the feudal lord began to extract much more than he should have. The serfs, oppressed by the feudal lords, now resolved to leave almost en masse, and a massive flow of internal migration began. Sweezy argued this fact, this external impulse of commercialization, the growing pressures of commerce almost forced open, yanked open as it were, the feudal economy, and the economy of no outlets suddenly began to collapse under the pressure of the growing seasons of commerce. The commercialization model then used the arguments that Dobb had originally presented in his internal contradictions thesis, and then turned it almost upside down. It turned it almost on its head. But Sweezy was not spared challenge either. Sweezy received his strongest critique from the British demographic theorist M.M. Poston. Poston raised this question, that why did the change take place at a time when it did? Why did commercialization take place in the 14th and 15th century and not in the 11th and 12th centuries? If from the 11th century commercial revolution was beginning to unfold, then how do you explain it reaching a peak only in 14th and 15th century? Also, Poston raised this question as to why did the gradual decline of feudalism follow in the manner it did? Why was it followed by the rise of capitalism only in the 16th and 17th century? Why did the rise of capitalism not accompany, as it were, the decline of feudalism? Poston's argument was that like all major long-term shifts in human history, this too has to be identified in terms of demographic changes. So Poston argued that the emergence of feudalism was ultimately a factor of changing demographics in Europe. Neither the collapse of the economy for economic reasons, nor the collapse of the economy, European commercial economy, for political reasons. Poston argued that the pivotal factor was population. Poston's position was feudalism had emerged at a time when in the 8th and 9th centuries the demographic character of Europe began to change as population began to decline. As the number of people began to shrink, the number of people available to cultivate land on behalf of the feudal lord also began to shrink. And at a time when population was becoming scarce, supply of labor was becoming scarce, the feudal lords had resorted to the practice of establishing serfdom. And this is how feudalism had emerged in the 9th and 10th century. And he argued the very reverse phenomenon ultimately led to its decline.
Over the centuries, due to waves of epidemics like the bubonic plague and continued warfare, Europe had dramatic ups and downs in its population. The dramatic loss of population affected European economy. Scholars have long debated the broader meanings of the demographic crisis and shifts in trade. Did they bring economic depression, or did they bring a new equilibrium in which standards of living, particularly among the wage earners, improved? The general price of labor rose, while land values declined. The former served the peasant class, which could now demand salaries for its labor. The latter hurt the nobility, whose wealth was derived from the properties of the estates.
From the 11th and 12th century, as commerce began to pick up, the inevitable corollary was there was greater surplus being generated. Greater surplus meant more food. More food meant better nutrition. Better nutrition meant growing population. By the 14th and 15th century, there was a mismatch in the numbers of supply and demand. Poston suggests that after steady growth in the 11th and 12th centuries, by the 13th century, there was something like a demographic crisis beginning to emerge, not in terms of actual population, but the fact that there was the Black Death. So while the birth rate was reasonably high, the death rate turned out to be higher. Epidemics of all sorts ultimately began to push the pressure of population down in the feudal estates. As a consequence, Poston argued that in the estates, although serfdom was more or less intact, the pressure on the feudal estate, the pressure on the serfs on the estate had begun to grow. The feudal lord had to tighten the screws, as it were, of feudalism, had to tighten the screws of serfdom as far as possible in order to retain a guaranteed supply of labor. This is the time in the late 13th and early 14th century when seigneurialism and serfdom reached its ugliest proportions. And then Poston argued that from the 14th and 15th century, you have a virtual reversal. In the 14th, 15th century, as more and more peasants began to disappear, the feudal lord was unable to gain access to labor very easily. And it was in this context that the feudal lord decided to go for the commutation of rent. So it was a demographic crisis in Europe, in Western Europe, that ultimately led to the decline of feudalism, according to Poston.
Demographic growth was the prime motor for agrarian progress. Agrarian progress, in its turn, was an essential prerequisite for commercial revolution. So long as the peasants were barely able to ensure their own subsistence and that of their lords, all other activities had to be minimal. When the food surplus increased, it became possible to release more people for government, religious and cultural pursuits. Towns re-emerged from their protracted depression. Merchants and craftsmen had been providing a fistful of luxuries for the rich and very few indispensable goods for the entire agrarian community. Now, they were much more productive.
Boston would argue that this was succeeded by the rise of capitalism at a time when population began to grow once again. So, feudalism emerged when population was going through a downswing. Serfdom began to flourish at a time when the feudal lords were presiding over the market for land, which was in more plentiful, which was in scarce supply by comparison with the population at hand. And then subsequently, as there was a population was declining as a result of Black Death and other such phenomenon, the feudal lord was unable to guarantee the labor supply that he would need, and so he began to commute rent. And by the time the population was moving in a steady upswing from the 15th, 16th century, capitalism had to emerge.
It takes more than food surplus, however, to reorient a society from agrarian balance to commercial restlessness. Until at least 1570, nearly all of Europe experienced vigorous demographic recovery. There were reoccupation of vacant holdings, along with notable urbanization, intensified agricultural and industrial output, and the extension of trading relations across much of the globe.
So Boston's argument was very decidedly deterministic, and it rubbished the theory of both commercialization and of internal contradictions. It was not individual decisions taken by the serfs and the feudal lords that was really crucial. Boston would argue it was the large-scale demographic shifts that first pushed Europe towards a feudalized economy and then pushed Europe away from a feudalized economy.
The essence of Paul Sweezy's commercialization model in explaining the rise of capitalism is the push-pull theory. While the burden of increasing taxes pushed the serfs out of the manors, the cities lured them into their fold and provided various alternative livelihoods. This explained the growth of capitalism in Western Europe and continuation of feudalism in Eastern Europe. The demographic growth model, on the other hand, could explain why feudalism broke down in the 13th and 14th centuries, followed by the rise of capitalism in the 16th and 17th centuries.